Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. And I hope the weather is better than in Lausanne. And we have just rain here today. So I'm going to talk about sort of a set of results that I've proved with collaborators. So I've just, to make sure I didn't forget anyone, I've just written collaborators. And I should probably thank the people who paid me. My ERC grant has run out, but EPFL, fortunately, is still paying me. And I'm very happy to be able to speak in this seminar series. It's a very nice idea to have it, I think. Now we come to the test. So people were worried because they said slide 1 out of 1, but you will now see that there's actually 2 out of 1. So before I get started and talk about some of the particular models we might end up with, I'm just going to do a little bit of a high-level understanding of the type of results we're looking to achieve. So we're going to be analyzing network data in general, and network data is about the interactions between different entities. So we have a set of entities. It might be you and your friends who email each other. It could be interacting genes or proteins. And what we record are actually those interactions. And just to make a distinction compared to what people sometimes do otherwise, we don't think we have data with a network valued parameters. So if you, for instance, have a graphical model that corresponds to having a network which specifies, for instance, as you see people, like maybe you record temperatures in many locations and you have a network which specifies which locations are close to each other. This is other data and it's not what I'm going to be dealing with. Why is it difficult to analyze network data? Well, there are 2 main hurdles one has to overcome. So as Hao kindly mentioned in her introduction, most of my past work is trying to understand ordered observations. So that's time series where we know the temporal location and we assume all the special properties of time. So time usually has continuity, it has a directionality, there is a notion of causality. But in a network, it really doesn't matter what order you observe it in. If you're looking at Jack, Jill, and James interacting, it doesn't really matter to the intrinsic object of their interactions, whether you're listing Jack, Jill, or Jill before John, or John before Jamie. Whatever people or entities you have in your network, you think mathematically it's the same object, irrespective of whatever labels you've stuck to the ordering. And the second big challenge is we're going to be dealing with simple graphs here. So that means we just observe when there is an interaction or there is not an interaction. This means we observe zeros and ones. Zeros and ones, as we all know, are Bernoulli random variables, and they're very, very noisy. So, I mean, you can even think about it when you look at a Bernoulli. If you square a Bernoulli, you get the same value. There are lots of things you can do to it, and it doesn't really change. And that sort of brings home to you that the intrinsic information it's providing you is very limited. So these are the 2 challenges we shall seek to overcome when we're studying network data. Now, after having told you that I'm going to look at networks, everyone who's given a talk on network is then, I think, legally obliged to show you an ugly diagram of a network. So I'm going to show you a few ugly diagrams of networks just to bring home what kinds of problems we might seek to address. So this is a network that I've been studying with actually a collaborator from UCL, Petros de la Portas, and others, and it corresponds to companies who are interacting, they're selling and buying goods. And what the person who controls the data wants to find out is, are any of these people committing fraud, or are they all doing legal things when they interact? Why are they concerned about fraud? Well, because they're buying and selling things, the government is trying to make them pay value-added tax. And to be able to request this, they have to be aware of the transactions. Now, the way value-added tax works in Europe is that I sell something to Hao, for instance, Hao sells it on to someone else, and no one actually pays the value-added tax until the last transaction. when the last person pays the value added tax on the whole interaction, because usually when you're buying and selling something, the value of it keeps increasing as it goes down the chain. And you don't want to have the friction of having to pay VAT at every part of this chain and then paying a little bit more as the relative value increases. So here the interactions are the trades. So it's more than a simple network that just has an interaction or not. You actually have the value of the interaction, and you'll see the little arrows, and the arrows are there because actually this is a directed graph. You know who's selling what to whom. And what you're trying to figure out is, are there special nodes, and here they're marked as orange, which you think are driving this idea of having trades, which instead of at the last go, when you're selling something to the customer, they should send their value-added tax into the government of the country it happens in. Instead, the company goes bust, the government never gets any money, and all the money has just disappeared. So this is an example of a network, because the idea is you want to find who's actually driving this fraud, but also you want to find everyone who's part of the interaction pattern which leads to fraud being committed, because as a government you want to audit those people, because you can't audit everyone. So this data set has about 250,000 different entities, they're companies, and you can't just audit everyone. So you need to target and audit those who are possibly committing crimes. So that's an example of a network. Here is another network. It's a little bit more complicated. This is an example of a set of interactions over time. So what you see on the top, don't know if you can see my cursor, where it says 6, 7, 8, 15, 16, 17, etc. These are times, and this is an interaction network in a hospital, and the people in the hospital are wearing proximity devices. So you record a little white or colored dot when people are physically near each other or proximate to each other, and then you think of it as having an interaction. In a hospital, you might be concerned that there's a spread of diseases with interactions, but here you have the additional pattern of actually having interactions and then interactions over time. And you can see that groups of different types of individuals in the hospitals, administrators, doctors, or médecins is from a French hospital ward in Lyon, nurses or patients. And you can see that, for instance, patients do not interact very much with each other. So opposite perhaps to what you expect. Interactions here are white or colored, non-interactions are black. I'm actually going to skip that one. So what is a network and what do we want to do with it? So the whole idea of having a network is to simplify the interaction patterns between entities. So you're trying to represent potentially complex behavior, but often quite sparse behavior. You don't expect everyone to interact with everyone else in a system. And there are two main important types of concepts in a network. There's the set of the objects that are interacting. We call them nodes, and normally we number them from 1 to n. And this is where I had the example of James and Jill and John, but normally we would just number them 1 to n. And then we have the interactions, which are just coupled pairs of vertices. And because we're going to be dealing with simple graphs, we would just record an interaction. Not if, say, Jack is emailing John or John is emailing James, we'll just record it as a Jack and James interaction. The data you get is in an adjacency matrix, which contains edge variables. So each edge variable just tells you if an edge is absent or present. And because we've assumed that there's no directions, this is going to be a symmetric matrix. We call it the adjacency matrix. And we want to model or understand what happens in this network. So what classical models exist? And on the right-hand side, I've just played around a little bit, and I'll explain what I'm doing. So what you see in the top plot, where you should see really 2 blocks, this is a political weblog data set. It's in the US, so it's highly polarized. People only quote other weblogs that think the same. And so you see very few interactions between the two blocks, and the blocks are really apparent. Now, a key feature of an adjacency matrix is that it records the interactions. You see which interactions are happening, but you don't know which way things should be ordered. It's not like a time series. So the problem with that is you really want to capture that the ordering should not contain any information. So just to show you how tricky that is to understand, if you look down to the second and third row of the adjacency matrices, you see the same adjacency matrix. First, where I've ordered it on the number of interactions any individual has. And last, where I've done a random ordering. I've just done a random permutation of the indices that's symmetric across I and j. And what you can see is, yes, there can be pattern, but if we truly believe that the way we observe the array is not deliberate or intentional or containing any direct patterns, then it's going to be quite hard to understand this latent structure you see in the top row from just seeing the bottom row. So the basic feature of this data is going to be one of a probabilistic symmetry. Namely, we think that if we took the adjacency matrix and we permuted symmetrically the rows and the columns, then we should get the same distribution. This is one of the fundamental characteristics of this object that we're going to study. So we say that permutation invariance of the distribution holds when the probability we observe given adjacency matrix is the same as the probability we observe another. We are not saying that the adjacency matrix is the same as the permuted adjacency matrix. We see that's not true from the tree plots, but basically we're saying the distributions we put on there should have this property. And then we say the distribution is permutation invariant, and usually this is achieved by having latent independent random variables. It feels a bit familiar. We have the same distribution if we have observations with a fixed action. Well, people who've studied things in time series, they have the notion of stationarity, and instead of having permutation invariance, you got translation invariant. Again, the distribution is the same, irrespective of how you shift the whole set of observations. In random fields, we can have isotropic observations, and in both of these cases, we get spectral representation. We can rewrite things in terms of Fourier transforms, and you can then ask, what do we get here instead? So a consequence of this permutation invariant, which we're going to refer to as exchangeability, is that we get the Aldous-Hoover theorem, which says that the adjacency matrix, given some latent variables, psi and gamma, has conditioned on these latent variables the same distribution in terms of some function f that may depend on gamma, but which we evaluate on some random locations. And because these random locations are IID, independent and identically distributed, we see that the model, as we were to permute I and j, would be the same model because IID observations when permuted have the same IID distribution. Now, the issue here is that to understand this observation, we want to estimate f. And normally, we just observe one network. We'll see a little bit more networks a little bit later. But normally, we just observe one, and then we can only estimate f gamma for one gamma. So we're going to get rid of that notation gamma and not worry about it. Now, what have people done? Well, they've assumed that this function f, which no longer has the gamma, is smooth. Maybe it is Hölder smooth. And they've proposed various ways of averaging the adjacency matrix in order to estimate f. And a key technique to use there is you cluster the indices or labels or nodes, and then you average in little patches. And because you're trying to approximate this function, it's a function on an interval, which we see from the specification of the Aldous-Hoover theorem. We get a better and better approximation as our number of nodes increases. So people who've done non-parametric estimations of objects, this corresponds to so-called infill asymptotics, because you have this notion that you're evaluating a function f on an interval, and you're getting more and more observation inside the interval. And for that reason, you can approximate F better and better. So I've done work on this some time ago, almost 10 years ago now, and various people have proved rate optimality of these sort of strategies. So the basic thing that comes up is we decide how we're going to average, and then we assume that the network has groups, but we're actually just trying to estimate locally how interaction probabilities are similar on this assumption that the distribution is permutation invariance, because once we assume that, Aldous-Hoover gave us the graph limit. We then put in the assumption that F was smooth, and once we did that, we can treat the network as if it had groups. What do I mean with saying we have groups? Well, one of the most common models to use for trying to understand networks is the stochastic block model, which assumes you have a set of groups in your network, maybe like the medics, the nurses, and the patients we saw before, and the administrators. We had 4 groups there. And we think that each has a particular interaction parameter. And we'll collect that in a matrix theta. And we'll have a label vector Z, which tells you for each node I, which group you're in Zi. So with a specification, you could specify a generative mechanism, which gives you the probability that an interaction is present, given that label, and you just evaluate the interaction matrix at that label. So there are many, many different ways of estimating the unknown label vector Z. There's spectral clustering. I have studied profile likelihood. There's combinatorial least squares and a variety of other methods. Before I looked at that problem, this pretty old problem by now, so we're going to get somewhere else. People had studied estimating that label vector, thinking that you only had a few number of blocks. And what my collaborator and I introduced was you can actually start to look at using this when you actually just assume permutation invariance of your network distribution and have a graph limit. You might say, hey, but you did throw in another assumption for the averaging or the block approximation to make sense. You assumed the graph limit was smooth. Well, a lot more recently than that old work. I worked with it, well, someone else, Swedish actually. And we saw that if we think that the graph is smooth in a particular dimension, then it's also going to be smooth with latent variables of a different dimension, of a smaller dimension, and we're still going to be able to do estimation. So it's not as constraining to throw that little assumption in, which I threw in a little bit hidden, so I wasn't very explicit about it, but it's there. So the basic idea here is we're trying to describe the interaction probabilities that could have generated the network. We're only assuming that the distribution has permutation invariance. And because we have this graph limits, we don't really have blocks. But what we're trying to do is to capture all of the variability we see in the graph from approximating the graph limit by having lots of little blocks. So this is the network I showed you the importance of permutations earlier, where I had the 2 blocks, US political blocks and web logs between the different blocks interacting and citing each other. We can make an approximation to their interaction probabilities. And you see that just saying they're 2 blocks is probably simplifying life a little too much. But there are additional behavior also within the groups where there are both people who like to interact more and people who like to interact less, but also additional grouping. And here I've plotted it a bit differently. Okay, so that's nice. And that sort of motivates why you'd want to look at subgroups in network and try to approximate the generating mechanism of an arbitrary network with using the stochastic block model. But there is a lot of other patterns. So here, for instance, is the VAT fraud data. You can see that clearly there appear to be some subgroups, whether they are specified as true block models or just as approximating something else. You can certainly discuss, especially for some parts of this network, but there certainly appear to be more features or patterns in the network. So how can we determine once we've decided we're going to have this general representation of any network which satisfies permutation invariance, can we determine by comparing two graphs if one is more or less complicated? So can we actually define the complexity of a network? And you have to be a little bit careful. People have looked at the notion of the complexity of a graph before, and whatever people do, they tend to call it graph entropy when they're trying to determine the complexity of the graph. But instead of trying to determine the complexity of a realized graph, because we can now say that any graph which is permutation invariable or coming from an exchangeable model, we are going to try to characterize or estimate the complexity of the underlying graph limit or graphon. So we're trying not to have the feature-dependent definition of entropy or have particular aspects, just like the degree distribution. The degrees just says how many friends each particular node has. We want to define something that intrinsically comes from the generic representation of any permutation invariant distribution of having this graph limit, and we're going to define the entropy from it. Well, we're not going to define the entropy, we're going to define the estimator, because people before have defined graphon entropy. So it's quite straightforward. So you take, as you would expect, the binary entropy function. So the entropy function is little h in this slide. And what, for instance, Hatami has already defined with co-authors is that if you have any exchangeable array, which then could be generated with this graph limit or graphon f, then we can define the entropy from any such functions by just taking our binary entropy function and shoving in the probability of having an edge, which is just little f. And then for the whole network, well, that's going to consider the whole graph limit over the whole area of naught 1 squared. We just integrate it out and we get the measure of complexity. So working with my PhD student, Aldous-Hoover, we have shown that if you have the block model approximation of the graph limit that I just showed you, which is 10-year-old work. Now, more recently, Anna and I have a paper out this year where we show that if you use a plug-on estimator and you still assume you have a smooth graph limit function, then if you compare the estimator you define from the block model, which I'm going to call h hat, then the difference between that and the true entropy of the graph limit is going to be decreasing with the number of nodes. So we can basically make up a concentration inequality, which tells you that this way of estimating the entropy leads to a consistent estimator as the graph gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I should do a little twist here. You might be worried because actually, when you estimate the graphon, you have to be a little bit careful because of the permutation invariance. You can't actually pin that function down completely. So you could actually, for any graph that you generate, have defined a different graphon by applying a measure-preserving transformation to the two variables x and y, and you would end up with the same realization. So normally you get rid of this by just defining f as being an element in an equivalent space, and as long as there is a measure-preserving transformation that makes it kind of the same, you're okay. Of course, once you integrate over all of naught 1 squared, none of that really matters, so we don't have to worry about it. And what does this look like in practice? Well, we took a network over time. So Norwegian law changed back in 2004 to ensure that there were enough women on board. So in 2004, Parliament in Norway decreed that all boards for companies had to have at least a proportion of 0.4 of women on boards. And as you can see, that fortunately Norwegians are compliant. So what happened after this regulation came into space was basically the average proportion increased until you hit the minimum legal limit. What we got from this data set is actually the networks of all the members of all the boards on Norwegian companies, because they have to go to the equivalent of Companies House in London and register their company and who is on what board. And you can create a network of all people who are on boards for the same company. And what this plot shows you is not a deep sociological study, but what it does show you is that as the proportion of women increased, the entropy of the network went down and it became simpler. So that's just basically, I'm not doing any deep sociological study, but it shows you that you sort of tweak the way the networks of the interactions on the boards were changing, and commensurately, you can characterize that in terms of the complexity we have just defined. So, okay, so that's all very nice. We have a way of approximating the generating mechanism of any graph that has this permutation invariance. But actually, in reality, and this is something other statisticians would really come down on me for having started like that. What if you get graphs which have additional information? We never have just one piece of data. We would normally know, maybe if we were studying individuals and how they interact, we might know where they live, we might know where their name is, we might know what their income is. If we get additional information, can we still use this framework to study where we're going? And of course, we can have additional information either per node. So if there are people interacting in a network, we might know what their salary is, or we might know how old they are, and many other variables. Or like the trade network I showed you from Bulgaria, where there were people who should be paying VAT, there we had additional information per edge. We had the value of each trade. And in general, this would break the permutation invariance, because now, in a sense, if we had additional information on each node would not, in a sense, statistically behave the same. Can we really use graphons in this setting? Because with extra information per node, clearly we cannot satisfy exchangeability. So what do people do in these types of settings, which do exist in practice? Well, often they change the way they do their clustering. So there's something called covariate assisted clustering, or you can turn the problem on its head and you can say, I actually want to understand your earnings based on who you know, because if your friends all have a lot of money, maybe it's likelier you make a lot of money. So we are not going to do that. What we asked ourselves instead is, can we improve the way we estimate the generating mechanism of the network by using this additional information? So just to give you an example of a setting where people have additional information, this is one network from a US study on adolescent health. The network is quite sparse. We've kind of been a little bit naughty and we made it denser by taking a directed network and making it undirected. So this network corresponds to asking lots of people in a class or school who their friends are. And then you have edges whenever someone says that they're their friend. And usually people have the undirected version where, like, I might say I'm House friend, but maybe House says, no, I don't know that Sophia lady. But here we made it undirected. So if one person say they're the friend of the others, then we say that an edge or an interaction is present. Now for this network, we do have a lot of other variables. So this is the US. So of course, people collected information on race. So you see that in the middle of the plot where we have the different colors. And if we try to approximate the interaction patterns of this school, it's actually from the South. You see that actually the block model approximation or the group approximation to the interaction patterns is strongly related to, well, most closely to the grade, which you see in from the middle plot. You sort of see the people interact the most with other people in their grade. And I think we all recognize that from going to school. But there's also, unfortunately, or maybe I shouldn't have opinion, there's a strong component where people interact more with people of their own racial covariate. So you sort of see here, this is a situation where there is information about interaction patterns on the basis of covariates that we also have available. So what you might say is, hey, maybe I want to estimate the interaction probability for people in a group, but then I want to use these covariates of what race do they have or what grade are they in. So how can we do that? Well, we are now going to try to model how those covariates or additional information might provide a better estimate of the probability of an interaction. So we're going to assume we have still this model of Bernoulli, ones and zeros that we generate for interactions, and we're going to have a graph limit function f, and we're going to assume that that rho is just to deal with the fact that as you get a bigger and bigger graph, like we don't want to make friends with everyone because we can't maintain life having 20,000 friends. So we're going to assume as there are more people in the network, the interaction probability scales down naturally with the size, and that's why we have the rho. And I've kind of just inserted that. There are complications with inserting it, but I'm not going to go into it. So the simplest case we're going to think about now is, what if we have a covariate, a variable like the grade of the person in the school, and we're going to think that this actually provides information about the latent variables that determine where we're evaluating this graph limit function. So we're now linking the covariate we see with the latent variable, but we're going to allow some misfit. So I'm not necessarily wanting to think of this like regular noise, but we're taking care of the fact that we don't think that this covariate exactly determines where we evaluate this graph limit function. If the noise or the discrepancy wasn't there, we could just threshold the covariate to exactly say what group you should be in. So it needs to capture this fact that the groupings are not perfect. Normally, when we're trying to link to things like this, like linearly, we would put a plus bx, like a normal line, but I don't have a and I don't have b. Why don't I have a and b here? Well, a can just be mushed into the graph limit function, doesn't matter. Why don't I have b? Well, I talked about this fact that we were just estimating a function which lived in a equivalence class of functions, and you could apply measure preserving transformations. So that b really can't be identified, and so we're just going to throw it under the carpet and forget about it. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to assume that we're trying to estimate the probability of an interaction. We're just going to call it p for now, and we're going to assume it depends on this covariate x that we have. This could be something like the grade you're in. Now, normally when we're trying to estimate the graph limit, and I call it p here, so I've thrown rho in with it, we can't have too many blocks. The reason for that is we show that it's good to use the block model with an increasing number of blocks with the network large enough, and we argue that the latent variables, we could reorder them in our mind, and we could think about the order statistics. And as we all know, order statistics behave in a certain limiting fashion, but they do have a residual variance as long as n is finite. And so it did not make sense to try to estimate this in more and more small little blocks, because eventually that variance is going to get you. But here we're kind of better off, because we think that this variable we have is related to the latent variable, so we don't have to subconsciously relate everything back to having some order statistics. Having done that, we are now going to try to estimate the interaction probability p from the adjacency matrix A. And what we're going to do is we're going to, again, make little block approximations, but now we're going to add a little linear term. So this would be a little bit like local polynomial regression. But the change here is that normally when we do local polynomial regression, we don't have this aspect of the graph limit that we're trying to understand. And so we're not coupling our covariate with some groups that we're using to approximate the whole graph limit function. So to do this, you need to decide how many of the groups, which we'll call K, that we'll need to use to approximate the graph limit function. And what was done before was that there was an argument that if you were able to order the latent variables, you could figure out how big blocks you could use. And you can now repeat this argument and determine how you should approximate the function if it were true that you actually had access to the true latent ordering. And then we can use that understanding of that approximation to decide how many blocks we need to get a good approximation of the function. And this is work with my ex-postdoc Swati Shanna, who's now working in Birkbeck in London. And what she showed was that as we try to approximate this graph limit function, we can still do it. But now, unsurprisingly, when we're using the covariates to get a better approximation to the interaction probability surface, we can use bigger blocks because we have the covariates that can still capture variability within a group. So here are some examples of the estimates you get. I'm not going to dwell too much in it because I'm on slide 27 of 1, and I should probably stop speaking in about 7 minutes. So I'm going to end up with temporal modeling because that's something I'm doing right now, and I find it really interesting because you're now trying to bring two probabilistic invariances together. You will have a network with the permutation invariance that you want to capture, but you will also have temporal modeling, so you think you have a shift invariance in time. So what is a temporal graph? Well, it's just a set of graphs that are chained together by what observation time we have for each graph. And what you start to worry about first is if you have multiple graphs. Okay, so for a Bernoulli, if you have a certain number of Bernoulli variables, you know how many parameters you need to capture their dependence. But being practical people, we might start with just looking at the mean, which would be like an interaction probability, and then a covariance if you're modeling a graph over time, because you don't expect all graphs just to flicker in and out. You do want to see some continuity in graph structure, and so you expect to see dependence between the graph at different time points. And you have to be a little bit careful, and this is other work I did with my ex-postdoc Swati Shanna. Not all possible dependencies are allowed. If you're modeling Bernoullis, it's not like modeling Gaussians, where you can freely specify all means and all covariances. Not all dependencies are allowed, so you have to be a little bit careful. So we're going to now study multiple interactions across time, and to make it easy, I'm going to keep the number of nodes that we observe constant over time. In theory, the graph limit framework could be extended to having a time-varying number of nodes, but I'm not going to go into that because it's complicated. So the simplest model you could possibly take, and this is work I did with one of my ex-postdocs here at EPFL, is to simply try to model what's the probability that we have an edge between node I and j at t, given we might have had edges at the time step before that, etc., etc. And you can then specify a function. So that would be the easiest way of trying to capture dependence. You'd have to be quite careful if you get too inventive when you write down these models. This is a probability. You do want it to lie between 0 and 1. What else do we want to capture? And I'm just going to show you a little bit how the constraints come in. We do want to capture networks over time that have similar properties, and that's why it's natural to assume stationarity of the edges. And you really want to have a sort of a balance between how much structure you capture in the mean versus how much gets caught in the covariance. And just to show you a little bit where these constraints come in, where you have to start to worry about specifying valid means, but also having a constraint in what covariances you're allowed to posit. So we put in particular functions G just based on the generalized linear model framework for Bernoullis. So the simplest model is just a generalized linear model in terms of the first time step behind. And when you do that, what you find is you can change the parameters that specify that model. We're going to call them CMB. They're just determining the importance of a ij t minus 1 in your model. You can get out. Okay, sorry. I'm going to try not to. I went the wrong way. So you can basically change what model and how you depend on aij t minus 1 by changing the parameterization of the model. But what you have to be really careful with is you're going to specify the marginal probability, but what correlation you're allowed or able to represent between two Bernoullis is not going to cover all the correlations that you would expect to have for a Gaussian random variable. So the simplest set of models you can propose, you have to specify how many past time points you depend on, which we're going to call capital K. And we're going to use, as I said, the generalized linear model framework. So you specify this as a Bernoulli that depends on sort of first linearly on the past, but then you have to use a model so that you're constraining the probability of having an edge at time t, so it lies between 0 and 1. So that allows you to get a valid set of models, which gives you a whole process which is correlated over time. And as you change your Bij here, you get different possible kinds of serial correlation. And to still sort of satisfy this notion of having groups, we let the Bij depend on what group I and j are actually in. And with this setup, we can still estimate the generating mechanism of the graph process. And often for human endeavors, we have to replace the parameterization of the B's and the C's by allowing for time-varying alternatives, because most human interactions are periodic over days, weeks, and years. But that's possible to just put in the model. And that's just showing you an example how things often are quite dependent. So this is showing the contacts in the hospital. As you go between different days, you see that the most contacts happen around noon. And of course, at night, there's not a lot of contacts. And so you can't make it truly stationary, but we've introduced just an overall interaction probability depending on time of day. So that's showing the hospital data again and the groups you find with that model. And finding the groups is actually easier because you have multiple replications and you think they're the same groups. You do have to account for the fact that the correlations and the moment structure you see in the graph will depend both on what group people are in. So H and M, etc., here refer to the fact that some groups interact more and some interact less, and we identify which group each node are in, but also we capture additional temporal dependence over the day. I'm not going to say much more. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, we use the stochastic block model to capture that people behave the same as other people who are in the same group or come from the same groupings or latent natural combination of people. But it's actually useful beyond our assumption that we truly think the data is generated by groups. And we can just start off from assuming that we have a permutation invariant distribution. The ordering we observe, the network nodes doesn't matter. And then we're able to estimate the generating mechanism non-parametrically. So we, in a sense, normally we get to the stochastic block model just because people use it. But in a sense, the reason they use it is you want to remove having such great degree of variability and variance. And so by finding groups, we can approximate how individuals are behaving. When is it wrong to assume that you can find groups and use them to approximate interactions? Well, you can actually you can go there and take away the Hölder assumption or change the Hölder assumption to different degrees of smoothness. You can have a little bit of jumps, and as you're going to be using a smaller number of groups than nodes, that's still fine, because if you think about approximating the whole area over 0 to 1 squared, it doesn't matter. And that sort of brings the argument that methods which are based on grouping even works in very heterogeneous and very large networks and data set, and can help us to achieve a simplified understanding of how different systems interact. So hopefully that brings me to the end, and I wonder if anyone has questions.